It's alive! Indeed. Little pigs, let me come in. Come on down, eat some of this shit. We'll tear your soul apart. The Halloween season is here again, and every time it comes, it brings out those good old nostalgic feelings. I think of Halloween as a very nostalgic holiday, so when deciding on my annual Monster Madness programming, I think back to all that TV programming you'd see during Halloween. It might be a horror movie marathon or some candy commercials. As soon as everything on the TV becomes all spooky, that's when you know it's the Halloween season. When all the graphics and titles are dripping in blood red or slime green, and there's random flashes of lightning, the narrator speaking in a Bela Lugosi accent, Elvira's on the screen advertising beer, Ronald McDonald is talking to Chicken McNuggets with fangs. It's such a big part of it, and that's how I've always felt. I've always associated Halloween with what's on my TV. And when I first came up with Monster Madness, I was trying to invoke those same feelings. But this year, what I want to talk about specifically is the tradition of the Halloween episode. You know what I mean. It's usually a sitcom or an animated show that dedicates a certain episode to celebrating the creepy holiday, whether it just has Halloween as a background setting, or Halloween is central to the plot, or just a spooky plot in general. One way or another, it acknowledges the season and reminds you what time of year it is. That's what I've always hoped to do, and that's what I've done in the Angry Video Game Nerd episodes as well. I've always celebrated the good old tradition of the Halloween TV episode. So I'm going to take you through a little history. I'm going to be talking about one TV episode per decade, from the 60s to the 2010s. That's 6 videos, each dedicated to a show I admire. I have touched on this subject before with Mike in one of the Monster Madness 2015 videos, and again in 2019 we did one about Halloween TV memories that was in the same format as rental reviews. But this time I want to really get down to it and single out some of these individual episodes. I would start with the 50s, but there really isn't much. The only major shows I can think of are Ozzie and Harriet and The Honeymooners, which both had an episode called Halloween Party. Both of them center around the planning for a party and both involve costumes. The Ozzie and Harriet one specifically has trick-or-treating and is a good starting place to see what a lot of these traditions looked like back then. There was an episode of Lassie called The Witch, where the boys suspect an elderly woman of being a witch. It doesn't explicitly mention Halloween, but I suppose it doesn't have to. The criteria is hard to nail down, but the only requirement I'll say is that the episode has to have aired during the Halloween season, and it must also have a Halloween setting or a spooky plot. Let's start with the 60s. This is a decade where television had become much more established and more common. There's lots of shows that would naturally fit into the Halloween season, like The Munsters, The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, and Thriller with Boris Karloff. But any of those episodes that coincided with Halloween didn't make it clear. Gilligan's Island had not one, but 2 spooky episodes that come to mind. One is ghost-themed and the other is vampire-themed, but neither one of them aired anywhere near Halloween. Star Trek had one called Cat's Paw, which featured a castle, witches, and a black cat, and it explicitly mentions Halloween. Yes, this was before William Shatner became the very face of Halloween. I could sit here mentioning examples all day, but the one I have to address is It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. That is the gold standard, the ultimate Halloween tradition. It has the fall leaves, carving pumpkins, making costumes, going to parties, trick-or-treating. It incorporates everything of the season. But it's not really a Halloween episode, it's a Halloween special. All the Charlie Brown films were just one-off productions that aired every once in a while, and was never an ongoing show. I do think it still counts because it's part of a franchise, but regardless, everyone knows that one, so let's give some attention to something else. I'm gonna go with The Addams Family. At first you'd think, well, isn't every episode of The Addams Family spooky enough? That's true, but they actually did make a specific episode for Halloween, twice. The first was called Halloween with the Addams Family, and it aired on October 30th, 1964. The plot centers around a pair of robbers, one of them played by Don Rickles, who hide out in the Addams Family house only to find that it's even scarier than jail time. The second episode was called Halloween Addams Style, and it aired on October 29th, 1965. This is the one I want to focus on today because I think it sums up the Halloween spirit even better. I don't know if I really need to explain the premise of the Addams Family, but basically it's an eccentric family that relishes in the eerie and macabre and are often described as sort of a satire of regular middle-class families of the time. As the episode begins, the mom, Morticia, is sharpening a knife which she hands to the dad, Gomez. He brings it to Uncle Fester, who's very excited. There's a great deal of suspense as to what he's going to do with that knife. It's a very well done scene with a very ominous and dangerous vibe, and it turns out that all Gomez is doing is carving a jack-o'-lantern, using Fester as the model. I must comment on Fester's weird, smiley expressions, which are priceless. It's a good example of Jackie Coogan's zany performance, which is what made the character so endearing. The other thing I must mention is that this sequence was actually recycled from the earlier Halloween episode. I guess back in the 60s, nobody really cared. Another thing to note is how part of the joke is that the jack-o'-lantern looks nothing like Fester, and it wasn't until the following Halloween when Charlie Brown repeated the same gag. Whether intentional or not, I'm unsure. Next, they're bobbing for apples using a type of seesaw. It's absolutely ridiculous. I've never seen bobbing for apples done that way. In fact, I've never seen anyone bob for apples in real life, ever. At least not that I can recall. Does anybody do that anymore? It's one of those old-fashioned party traditions. It's in many of the Halloween episodes I've mentioned, including The Great Pumpkin, and if we were ever going to bring back bobbing for apples, maybe we should do it like the Addams Family. Or maybe not. That looks pretty dangerous. Not to mention, Morticia has a gun. Yeah, it's the old starting gun trope, best suited for race cars or whatever, but in lots of these old shows and cartoons, they would always use that whenever there was some kind of game or contest taking place. And here it is at its most silly, which is exactly what you'd want with the Addams Family. It's worth noting in the earlier Halloween episode, they were bobbing for crabs. Man, that's a whole other level. Next thing, their butler Lurch cuts a sandwich in half with a guillotine. Gomez is all thrilled by the cutting job, all peppy and chipper, which always makes it funnier when, by contrast, Lurch just goes, ugh. That's Lurch in a nutshell. You gotta love it. Lurch was played by Ted Cassidy and always speaks in grumbles, like he's just miserable all the time. I don't know where the trope of the gloomy butler started, but I often wonder if it was the character Morgan in The Old Dark House, played by Boris Karloff. At the time, he was fresh off playing the Frankenstein monster and was kind of typecast, so Morgan always speaks in those weird mumbles, and I don't know if that's where the Lurch personality came from, but just speculating. Then the daughter Wednesday is back early from trick-or-treating. She's dressed as a princess, which is the opposite of the Addams Family's typical morbidness. They comment that her costume is terrifying, but the thing that finally gets the plot going is that Wednesday was told by one of the neighbors that there's no such thing as witches. To the Addams, this is a great offense. It could only be equated perhaps to maybe telling a kid that there's no Santa Claus. So Gomez and Morticia go on a mission to prove to her that witches do exist. Morticia explains they had a great aunt who was burned to death during the witch trials. Her name, appropriately, was Aunt Singe. They decide to have a seance with her. If she answers, the idea is that it would prove she's a witch. And this leads up to a big seance scene, and it wouldn't be the last time a big seance happens in the Addams Family, as there was a memorable scene in the 90s reboot. And of course, you gotta have Thing on the table, the Addams Family's disembodied hand servant. I believe that's the pun, yes. Before the seance, Grandmama secretly talks with Lurch, telling him that Halloween is the busiest night of the year for witches and that Aunt Singe probably won't respond. So they hatch a plot to fake it, for Lurch to perform the voice of Aunt Singe from behind the wall. This makes for some really funny moments because it's so jarring to hear Lurch speak in a high-pitched witchy voice. You call! It's so bizarre. And even funnier, there's a part where he's back to just being Lurch, and he forgets to stop talking in the witch voice. Hilarious. They also invite another member of the family to the seance, the elusive cousin Cackle. So elusive, I think this is the only episode he's ever appeared in, physically at least. So between this madman and Aunt Singe, this episode introduces more of the Addams relatives and expands the lore. Anyway, Cousin Cackle is, something. While the rest of the family's eccentric, he is straight up psycho. He's just some scruffy old hermit that they say has lived in the attic and in caves. And it's one of the best lunatic laughs I've ever heard. Once again, drawing a connection with the old dark house, it's similar to the raving laughter of Saul, who also spent most of his time in the attic. I'm beginning to think the old dark house was the original Addams Family. The seance is a success thanks to Lurch's bogus witch voice, but now they all think Aunt Singe is on her way, so Grandmama has to think of another plan to keep the trick going. Meanwhile, Gomez brings home a horse for Wednesday in case all fails. This is where the episode kinda takes a dumb turn. Why a horse? You know, they missed a good opportunity for a Mr. Ed crossover. Fester walks in and mistakes the horse for Aunt Singe. I don't know why, other than just because he's Fester. Things get back on track when we see some trick-or-treaters outside, adults oddly, who are actually on a scavenger hunt. I have to comment on the costumes. I'm beginning to think the witch and devil are among the most cliché, especially the devil. You even see that back in the Ozzie and Harriet episode. Unfortunately, the devil costume doesn't photograph well in black and white. You want to see that red, but back then I guess you were a rebel if you dressed like something that epitomized pure evil. So the one dressed as the witch arrives at the Addams house, and they all think she's Aunt Singe. The gag continues for a while until the pet lion, Kitty Cat, comes down the stairs. The witch shrieks in fear, and I guess the shriek is so intense, it sends the lion scrambling back up the steps. They do that old trick where they reverse the footage, which amplifies the humorous effect. That's actually another recycled shot from the first Halloween episode, and I wouldn't be surprised if they use that many more times. After all, if you filmed a real lion, I guess you'd probably want to use it as many times as you can. So Aunt Singe, I mean the person dressed as a witch, has fainted and Cousin Cackle wakes her up, and as soon as she sees him laughing maniacally in her face, she screams again and jumps out the window with a broomstick. As the episode comes to a close, we assume that Wednesday's faith in witches has been restored, and not only that, but the neighbors too. The neighbor calls and says, "You need to get that witch off your roof." Grandmama replies, "There is no witch on the roof. I was just up there." And there you have it. One thing missing from this episode is Wednesday's brother Pugsley. They mention him saying he's out trick-or-treating, but we never see him. Final thoughts, I think this episode represents Halloween very well, considering that in the 60s the idea of a Halloween episode was still a relatively new concept. With the pumpkin carving and apple bobbing, it reminds you that Halloween is about celebrating certain traditions in your own way, no matter how bizarre. Also, the idea of a seance and communicating with the dead was actually a big part of the origins of Halloween. It was the night when the barrier between the living and the dead was the thinnest. In a way, Halloween really used to be a celebration of the dead. And at last, the idea of believing in witches also brings us back to the roots of Halloween, because we all know there's no such thing as zombies or werewolves, whatever. But deep down inside, we want to believe, don't we? Just a little. We want to be scared. We want to go to haunted houses, but we know it's not real. In some way, a lot of these shows in the 60s were about the thrill of imagination. In the Charlie Brown special, Linus thinks there's some kind of legendary being called the Great Pumpkin, but it never comes. I've mentioned Gilligan's Island. In the episode Ghost a Go-Go, the only ghosts are people in sheets. And in Up at Bat, Gilligan gets bitten by a bat and becomes a vampire, but it's all just a dream. So I think that make-believe quality was a big theme back then, and an important but more forgotten aspect of the Halloween season. So, go conjure yourself up a good scare and see you next time with an episode from a different show from the 70s.